Thank you, Valentine. Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everybody. Hello, so nice to see you. Today we have a lot of people attending this event, so that's always great when you host something that people are really interesting. And I'm also really proud of the lineup we have today. We have a lot of interesting speakers and a different perspective on the subject of today. As you already know, the subject is bigger, really better for all due to the recent blockade of the Suez Canal. My name is Vera. I'm a member of the European Parliament and especially from the Transport Committee, and I'm a member of Parliament since 2019. But before that, I was a politician for 14 years in my hometown, Venlo, and Venlo is in the Netherlands, but it's also 5 minutes from the German border. And I always explain it like you have all the cargo in the haven of, in the port of Rotterdam, and all the cargo there arrives then to Venlo, and from Venlo it goes by inland waterways, by trucks, and train to the rest of Europe. So logistics is really important to me. In Parliament, I have been negotiating the initiative report on the maritime transport, and currently we are working on the initiative report on the inland waterways. And as you already know, we are also awaiting several revisions of legislation under the Green Deal. So a discussion as we have this afternoon on the size of ships and port congestion is therefore urgently needed in this context to get all the information that we as legislators and as politicians know what type of problems there are and what we could do in the future to make it we hope we can improve it and to make it better. So we all saw the pictures of the huge Ever Given ship operated by Evergreen getting stuck in the Suez Canal on the 23rd of March of this year. And as you know, with 400 meters, the length of the Ever Given is one of the largest container ships in the world. And this blockade led to very long waiting times for other vessels and had enormous economic consequences. So in addition, the blockade led to delays for weeks and weeks and to port congestion due to capacity problems further down the chain. This also affected the workflow for transport workers. So this incident is not the first and will probably also not be the last as the size of ships continue to increase. So today we will all talk about not only the Suez Canal, but about the consequences of megaships in general. And I'm really glad also that my colleague Jutta Paulus will co-host this event together with me. Thank you, Jutta, for that. And I will give you the floor now so you can introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vera, and thank you for having the idea in the first place. And I really appreciate also your experience and your huge knowledge on maritime transport, because other than you, I'm not from the coast and I'm not really acquainted to all the issues. But becoming an MEP in July 2019 and then becoming rapporteur on the MRV file, CO2 emissions from maritime transport, of course, I had to learn a lot in quite a short time. And I visited Rotterdam, I visited Hamburg, I spoke to a lot of people from port authorities, to ship owners, to ship operators, to workers. So trying to have the full picture of this important issue. I'm on the ENVI committee as a full member, and I'm substitute member in TRAN and ITRE, so Transport and Tourism and Industry, Research, Energy, and all these committees touch upon maritime transport in one way or another. Not last but not least with the upcoming ETS emission trading scheme, which will be extended to maritime transport, as Parliament has voted for last September with a very large majority of, I think it was 543 people that said we should include maritime into the ETS in order to finally start pricing the emissions. I will also be following the Fuel EU Maritime file, which will be issued by the Commission this year. So there again, we have the maritime issue. I think the Suez Canal blockade, as you have already said, has sort of highlighted to the broad public the problems and the issues we are facing with mega ships. There was a lot of talk about disrupted supply chains, vulnerabilities of EU supply, and while we often hear that bigger ships are more efficient, this is of course true only when they are fully loaded, because if a large ship is not fully loaded, then it will transport a lot of thin air, so to speak, and therefore it is not automatically the case that the ship is more efficient. What we are seeing also is that the port infrastructure has to be adopted to these newer, larger ships year after year. And this, of course, are very high costs, which are borne by the public. It's not the ship owners or the ship operators paying, but it's public money. I found out that at the port of Hamburg, it was water depth maintenance cost of 85 million euro in 2015, which was paid by Hamburg, not by the port itself. And this is just Hamburg, right? So if you take into account the whole stretch of the Lower Elbe out to the North Sea, there is another 132 millions which go into dredging. So I will listen very closely to the presentations because I'm really eager to learn more on what can we do, which would be a sensible way to approach the issue. And of course, I will do my utmost to finally get the maritime sector to work more on climate, because I'm also the delegate to the IMO, where talks are ongoing last week and this week, and there, unfortunately, not a lot of progress is being made. There are now agreements on a market-based measure, which will probably until 2030 cut just close to 3% of the emissions of the sector compared to business as usual. So it might not even be a real cut, but it might even be an increase, which is just not so large as was originally thought. And there, I think the sector really has to do more. We cannot just go on like we have done in the past. There was the UNEP report last year estimating that if every country would be following its path, that shipping and aviation would just be let loose, so to speak, then in 2050, our budget would be largely comprised of shipping and aviation. That shows very clearly that we have to get on a path for more sustainable shipping pretty soon, because ships are sailing in the seas for decades and we should build sustainable ones as soon as possible. Thank you, Vera, for organizing this, and thank you, Port, for making it possible.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we can continue to the introduction of the topic, and therefore we have Olaf Merck from the ETF and OECD, if I pronounce it correct. So welcome, Olaf. Nice to have you here, and please take the floor and give us your introduction.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'll now start immediately the most delicate operation, which is trying to share my screen. Can you see the screen? Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Olaf Merck. I work at the International Forum. And thanks so much for the invitation to speak today at this event on this important theme. I suppose I've been asked to do this because we wrote a report on mega ships in 2015. That is the first cover you see. And I think there's actually also other publications that we wrote that are related to this topic that are relevant. We wrote on alliances, we wrote on maritime subsidies, and I'll say more about this in the presentation. I think these are subjects that are actually linked. I have 5 questions that I'll try to answer in this presentation. Of course, the question, the overall question of this online event is bigger, really better for all. And I'll try to do that answering 5 questions. The first is, why do we have megaships? The second is how megaships foster concentration, who benefits, how the policies facilitate megaships, what did the COVID crisis reveal, and then I'll finish with some possible policy options. I'll try to go quickly through it. I have a lot of pictures, but I'll show them and not explain everything. So why do megaships exist? Why do we have these? Well, the simple answer is economies of scale. So it brings lower costs per transported container, per transported TEU. And that's why over the last decade, we have seen the average container ship capacity double since 2004. And actually the maximum capacity of these ships have tripled over that period. The issue that we identified with megaships is it means economies of scale on the seaside. It actually means additional costs on the land side. And of course, I'll say more about this later. This is a picture of the container ship capacity, the average container ship capacity, and the maximum capacity, that is in blue. And if you look at the maximum capacity, you see the abrupt changes inside, well, almost every 10 years, if you look at it. Now, the second question is, what kind of system did these megaships stimulate, facilitate? And I think it's important to make a link between megaships and concentration. If you want to operate a weekly Asia-Europe service, you need to have a string of these megaships that are expensive. And we think this, in a way, is a barrier to entry. And that has resulted in more concentration of the market, which probably was an intended effect of megaships. And it has also led to more alliances, which is probably an unintended effect of megaships. So a few numbers in terms of concentration. If you compare the market share of the top 4 ship operators, it's now 58%. That was 30% in 2006. Another form of concentration, I think, is the alliance. So this is the cooperation between the carriers on a bundle of trade corridors, and most of this on the East-West trades. And if you look at that, you see that the top 9 carriers, they are, well, regrouped in 3 alliances. Together, they have an 83% market share. Alliances had a market share of 30% in 2006. Then I think there is a third element important to mention here, which is the consortia, which is the cooperation on one specific trade corridor. And this has also become a tool of the largest container carriers. So if you look at the numbers, you see that the top 9 carriers operate around 85% of the capacity of consortia. And what is important to highlight here is that consortia are between carriers that are in the same alliance, but also actually between carriers in different alliances. And we found that around a quarter of the consortia is actually that. So in a way, consortia act as bridges between alliances, you could say. These are a few pictures to illustrate that this is the global capacity share of different sorts of consortia. You see this has increased, but I think the most important thing is that it illustrates that consortia really have become tools for the largest carriers that are also active in alliances. This is what I meant with consortia as bridges between alliances. Of course, you have the large carriers in alliances, but you also have strong links between the carriers that are in different alliances. So in a way, you could say there is one conglomerate of consortia that does most of the liner shipping. Now, the question that you wanted me to answer also is who benefits from this? So identified the shippers, port terminals and maritime service operators, shipbuilders and equipment manufacturers, the environment, and then of course also the carriers. When you look at shippers, in a way shippers benefited from moderate freight rates until last year, basically. But the mega ship model and mega ships in general have also led to declining service frequency, so less and less weekly services, and also less choice for shippers when it comes to well, services, but also operators. Ports and terminals, well, it has already been said, they need to invest to be ready for these mega ships. And at the same time, it's also becoming increasingly difficult to recover these costs from the shipping companies. And then it also leads, mega ships lead to more peaks in ports in terminals. Another effect is also the redundancy of a lot of the secondary ports that are no longer on the main lines of the bigger ships. Who benefits? Well, certainly the shipbuilders and equipment manufacturers, of course, because in a way, these cycles of let's say, upsizing of ships has meant that a lot of new ships have been built, obviously, but also new equipment, including, for example, container cranes. And a lot of these manufacturers and shipbuilders come from Asian countries, I should stress that. Well, did mega ships benefit the environment? And it's a question that was also raised in the introduction. Well, larger ships lead to less CO2 per TU kilometer. That is a fact. Does it lead to less emissions? Well, that would only lead to less emissions if half of the world's population would live in Shanghai and the other half would live in Rotterdam, to put it a bit schematically. Of course, what happens in practice is that let's say there is an increase in TU kilometers because there is some sort of a hub and spoke system related to mega ships. So there are less direct port-to-port connections, which means that the people that live in these port cities and these destinations still need to get their cargo, and they get this in the end by smaller coastal ships or maybe by trucking. And then you could also say there's probably peak effects in port cities. Of course, the peaks of these very large ships, and that is of course more relevant to emissions like NOx emissions and particles. Finally, who benefited? Well, certainly over 2020 and what we're seeing now, the carriers, they have had a record profit margin in the first quarter of 2021. A few pictures to illustrate. This is the development of the freight rates. These are global ocean freight rates. And these are the China-Europe freight rates. The picture looks more or less similar, but there are a few differences, and I'll get to that shortly. One of the differences is a question of timing. Of course, freight rates are, let's say, the rates that the shippers pay for their cargo. Then there's always also surcharges, and what we saw is there have also been various rate increases in some of these surcharges. Less choice for shippers. I already mentioned this. For example, the number of ship operators servicing the Netherlands and Dutch ports has halved over the last 15 years. I take here the example of the Netherlands because of the host of this online event, but of course this is also true, maybe even more true for some other countries. A declining weekly service frequency. Well, here I took the example of Germany. It has declined by 40% over the last 15 years, and the direct calls have declined by 30%. So ships have gone bigger, but the result is that more of the cargo is, of course, in these big ships, and the number of services has actually gone down. So less choice for shippers, less operators, and actually also less differentiation in the services that are provided. Well, there's a lot more that you could say about what's happening when it comes to the service quality. I simply refer to a lot of the good work that has been done by the Global Shippers Forum and MDS Transmodal that have started a regular monitoring of service quality of container shipping to Europe. Something that you think a regulator should also be interested in doing, but this is now done by them. Then the ports and the terminals, they of course are faced with a lot of costs they need to make to adapt to these mega ships. That is the same for ports, for terminals, and also for maritime service providers. I listed some of the costs, and then there's also the peaks that are related to these much bigger ships that they have to deal with. So higher cost, but at the same time also less possibility somehow to recover these costs via, for example, via port fees. So if you look at this figure, this is the data from one carrier, where it clearly shows that the port fees that that they had to pay, but that had been collected by ports, declined by 30% over the last decade. Well, who benefited? If you look at this picture, you clearly see that there were profits in the previous quarters, but that especially 2020 and also the first quarter of 2021 have been very profitable quarters, reaching now 500 euros of profit per container that is transported. That brings me to the fourth issue, which is how a lot of different policies have actually facilitated mega vessels and also this mega vessel system, if you like. A few observations to make here. First, ship size is not regulated. It's not included in the EU weights and dimensions directive, of course, unlike a lot of the other transport modes. Mega ships are actually publicly funded. There is state-backed financing in terms of loans and guarantees, accelerated depreciation for shipping firms, which stimulates, of course, a lot of the investment in these ships. Then there's also very low effective tax rates for the shipping sector via tonnage tax schemes, and a lot of these tonnage tax schemes are in Europe. And then there is funding for ports to adapt to the mega ships. Then there are shipping specific exemptions from competition rules, in particular the consortia block exemption regulation, and also EU regulation that support vertical integration of carriers, in a way also creating market distortion via the decisions that were made on ancillary activities in tonnage tax schemes. And finally, there is port pricing with very low cost coverage in ports, which is in a way also facilitated by the port competition that is at the core of Europe's port policy. Again, a few pictures. These are the effective tonnage tax rates in the European countries. So basically between 0.5% and 2.5%, which obviously is much lower than the average corporate income tax rates. And these are the ancillary activities, some of them, that can be covered by different tonnage tax schemes in Europe, as also approved by decisions of the European Commission. I mention this because, in a way, this has also stimulated the vertical integration of carriers that are, of course, also doing these ancillary activities and that can be brought under tonnage tax schemes in these countries. Brings me to of course, the important question: what actually about the COVID crisis, and did it reveal anything about this system? This is what a major carrier has to say about the situation in which we are, which has the three specific causes for the supply chain situation at the moment: a demand explosion, the bottleneck are carriers, and there is a shortage of containers. And the question that I'll try to answer here is this a convincing story for what's actually happened in Europe? The demand explosion, if you actually look at the monthly container volumes that were transported to and from Europe, you see that the volumes over 2019 were actually 1.7 million containers higher than over 2020. So there wasn't really a demand explosion in 2020. In the first quarter of 2021, there was a little bit more demand than the first quarters of 2019, but it is more or less in line with what you call a regular growth rate. So demand explosion in Europe, not really. Actually, what's taking place is there is a lot more demand in the US, and that apparently is impacting the situation in Europe. Is there port congestion in Europe? Well, we looked at what are the added, the cancelled and shifted calls in the port of Rotterdam in the first quarter of 2021. And what we saw is, well, there are very few added calls in Rotterdam. There are quite a lot of cancelled calls in Rotterdam. So that seems to show that, well, the port is quite full, but actually a lot of added calls elsewhere in North Europe. So that seems to suggest that if carriers can go to Rotterdam, they can actually go to another port in North Europe. So if one European hub port is full, other ports actually seem to function as a backup. Well, that hasn't happened in the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, where we've all seen the stories in the media about how many ships were there lying at anchor just waiting for a spot to open up in the port. The question that you could ask there, of course, is that actually port congestion, or did it start really with ship schedule reliability? And if you look at the numbers, you see that the reliability on Shanghai, Los Angeles, Long Beach actually started to go down much earlier than, let's say, the demand surge in the port of LA Long Beach. Interesting to note as well is that there is, let's say, the worsening of the schedule reliability in Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles coincides with the maximum, with a strong increase in the maximum size of ships that went to the ports. So let's say a lot of the mega ships that were usually on the Asia-Europe route were also used in LA Long Beach, and these ships were in the second quarter of 2020, the third and the fourth were also used. So one could wonder if there isn't a link there as well. So what did the COVID crisis reveal? Well, probably also a misalignment of capacity and incentives to solve the bottlenecks. So possibilities to divert traffic to other ports in case of congestion, well, it seems to work in Europe, but it's complicated in some other parts of the world, and that is related obviously to the upsizing of ships, because there's only a few ports in some parts of the world that can actually handle these ships, and also because carriers have interests in terminals, so will choose to go to their own terminals. Then I think that should be mentioned as well is that carriers have shown remarkable joint capacity management, if you want. So that is the coordinated capacity withdrawal, that obviously was there to avoid losses, but has actually now also led to record profits. Important point to make there is that most of the consortia that are there actually exceed 30% threshold in the EU regulation. So this starts to become an issue that probably needs to be looked at. A few slides there. They have joint capacity management, so they can withdraw capacity if they need, which is what they did during the COVID crisis, and this has led to 12% idling of ship capacity at the height of the COVID crisis in the week 22 in 2020.
Olaf, if you could just speed up a bit, because we are already running over time.
Yes, I'll try to go quickly through this. I just wanted to say this raises a couple of questions, I think, that deserve to be answered. One of the questions is, well, the freight rates already started to rise in May 2020. But the ship capacity was only back to normal in September 2020. Another point to make is that the freight rates in Europe only started to rise really in the fourth quarter, when there was actually much less capacity put on Europe trades than on Trans-Pacific trades. So that is also something that is interesting to note. Coming to the end then, the megaship model is not really resilient. Well, what did we see? We saw that problems with schedule reliability of megaships in Los Angeles can lead to supply chain problems in Europe. We have seen that freight rates for European cargo can get 6 times higher even if there's no more demand for ocean freight in Europe. We've seen that carriers can collectively redeploy capacity between trade corridors in order to maximize profits. Also that megaships have actually created this system of hubs and spokes, but that this model is very vulnerable to any disruption to any specific hub. And that container shipping has developed into a conglomerate of consortia, mostly invisible, but also it seems fairly untouchable. My last slide is just a couple of possible policy options that are related to this. Ship size, some countries, they regulate ship dimensions. Competition, so questions to be asked about capacity management of carriers. Some strategic utilities have tariff regulation. Well, if container shipping is a strategic sector, maybe also there. Building up capacity to monitor competition in liner shipping, for example, in line with what the US has done with specific federal maritime commission and special treatment of liner shipping and competition law. Then there is something about state aid and taxation, the tax loopholes in shipping. There's an ongoing discussion on the global minimum tax and of course the question whether shipping should be included or not. There are market distortions created in EU tonnage tax schemes, how to address that. And a lot of the shipping subsidies are there without a lot of public goals and conditions, and that is something that we also in the past advised to look at. And finally, something on port pricing, a possibility would of course be to introduce minimum port charges to actually make sure that public investment gets recovered. And I'll end here. I hope this was helpful for your discussion. Happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olaf. I think that was really very interesting, and it would be great if you would be so kind as to share your slides, because there have been several questions already in the chat whether we could have the slides for further perusal, just to reflect upon the numbers. It was, of course, a lot of information, and thank you so much for the comprehensive approach here. We will now move to our first panel. And there we would like to look at the economic rationale behind big ships. Olaf has already told us a lot about this, and I would like to introduce our first panelist, which is Nicolette van der Jaak. I hope I pronounced it correctly, from Klikkat. And Klikkat represents freight forwarders. So your clients are shippers, exporters, importers, if I remember correctly. How is your assessment of the model of mega ships? Are these economies of scale really coming true? And what does this mean for you as a freight forwarder? Nicolette, please. I can't see Nicolette. Does anyone see her?
Her microphone is still off.
Ah, sorry. Okay. My apologies. Thank you very much, Mrs. Paulus, and also Mrs. Tax and the European Parliament for organizing this debate. I think it's an extremely important topic, and I'm really happy that this is brought to the attention of the Parliament. It is, of course, challenging to talk after Olaf Merck, because basically he raised everything, and I have to say that as an economist, he always points to the right topics, and I think his analysis is completely correct. I can only repeat some of the things, maybe from a little different perspective, from the perspective of the freight forwarders and the logistics service providers. But overall, I think his analysis is extremely complete, and I can't agree more with all the points that have been raised. Maybe I'll come from a little different perspective, as I said, because I think that indeed our perspective is, where are we today? Are our members, which are indeed the logistics service providers, still able to serve their clients, the shippers? And I have to say that today the situation was bad a year ago, but today it's only getting worse. Of course, the topic for today is the reference is made, the picture of the enormous large container vessel in the Suez Canal. Today, we're in a situation where we see further congestion, which is caused by, well, sort of the COVID crisis picked up again in China, Southeast China. We see that the port of Yanqing is being blocked. So I think, as Olaf said, the situation today is only getting worse, and the current crisis, the current maritime supply chain is not able to cope with it. We see a continuous shortage of vessels, of equipment in the global container shipping markets. It's everywhere. It's hindering the economic recovery. I think that our members will equally the shippers, and many of them are contacting me also from other associations representing all sorts of industries, the industries of toy manufacturers, of vehicle manufacturers, spare parts, biking industries. Everybody is sort of in shock at the moment because of, not only because of the high price, and that is of course impacting a lot of the SMEs, but also the collapse of service performance, because basically it's becoming impossible to plan. You see it now, if you want to book a container, it can take you 3 months. So this is really getting really bad. We also see that, I think that the consumer is starting to feel the impact. I don't know whether you already personally was confronted with it, but for example, I go to shops and I can't buy my spare parts for my bike. It's difficult to get hold of some sort of cartridges for printers. I think more and more the consumers will feel it. And then also, of course, I'm afraid that some SMEs will go out of business. So yeah, where is this all coming from? This session is of course about the economic rationale for big ships. And indeed, we did support the economic analysis from the ITF back in 2015. And I do think that the arguments still stand, but maybe at that point in time, the freight rates were indeed relatively low. But at that point in time, carriers were still in the rat race to invest in bigger ships without really consulting their customers, without really asking whether there was not a need for smaller ships. to better serve some of the markets, because as I explained, you always have to bring your containers door to door. So there are longer stretches on the land side, which sort of, and then increases the pressure on the infrastructure. And of course, the carriers would only look at their economies of scale and at the seaside.
Oops.
Okay. My intention is not to hit out the carriers. I'm afraid that we already did so, but to look really at the what happened, because we do know that carriers did, just prior to the crisis, the pandemic, did say that they were they were supposed to focus more on service levels. This was clearly too late. Service levels have never been so low as they have been today. Question also is, as explained by Olaf, that how much room is there to really offer different services if major shipping lines are organized on only 3 alliances sharing their vessels? There is no room for competition. We do not see new entrants in the market, except for maybe a few established niche operators. The investments to compete with established and highly protected alliance system members are simply too high. And it's clearly operating in a closed market. Yeah, then of course we see that at the beginning of the crisis, service levels only became worse. We saw that sort of the capacity management was being introduced because, of course, carriers were afraid that demand was going down. The opposite happened. But there was massive blank sailings already at the very start of that crisis of the pandemic. Even before the pandemic, there were blank sailings. At the point that sort of everything was so disrupted that even when capacity came back in September, the car continued to be rolled because the system was already too disrupted.
Yes, I mean we have seen Olaf's slides also on that, right? That,
I'll leave that.
And the capacity went up in the US, so that was also an effect, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that I'm jumping in here, but I'm the person who has to look at the time, so I would propose that we first collect the input from our 3 speakers from the panel, and then we could go to the discussion and Q&A. And I'm happy to introduce to you Jacob Armstrong from TNE, Transport and Environment, which is an NGO focusing on the environmental cost of transport and especially also on shipping. This is one of the very few NGOs that is really looking in depth into the issue. And yes, Jacob, nice to have you here. And I would like to know, what does TNE say? I mean, of course, a bigger ship is usually more energy efficient per unit, but is this always true? You have probably collected a lot of intelligence on this issue, and you can tell us whether the less CO2 per ton kilometer is really true, or whether we have an increase maybe even in kilometers, because you maybe cannot sail to the port which you actually would like to sail to because your ship is just too big. So Jacob, please, what's your assessment as an NGO?
Yes, so thanks very much, Jutta. In terms of the kind of the climate and environmental risks of these big ships, I think there's kind of two things to think about. First of all, there is the local risks. So we're talking about the things in port, for example, dredging that you'll need to do more regularly, which also brings up a lot of CO2. You're looking at things like more discharges, oily discharges, also scrubbers and things like this. And then there's also kind of local environmental things in the deep sea. So you're thinking about things like noise pollution from marine species. So there's all of these issues which need to be taken into account for the biggest ships. But then, of course, what we're looking at in particular is the wider climate impact. And of course, as has been said, the main thing about these bigger ships is that they're sold essentially on the back of energy efficiency. So, the whole point is that, if you can get everything on this ship, then you've got great energy efficiency. But I think one of the things that Olaf mentioned as well at the beginning is it's not clear, and I don't think not yet enough research has been done on this, if that translates in the total system to better environmental performance, especially with this hub and spoke model, if how it works in terms of the networks. But when you're looking at the individual ship, I think there is a big problem here, because the point about these bigger ships is they do have, especially when they're going at speed, a bigger, kind of relatively bigger emissions. And so one of the things now is that because you've got these bigger ships, but they're very, very rarely fully laden, then those external environmental costs are not taken into account by the ship owners and the ship operators. So I think basically one thing maybe looking kind of forward is that this is very important going forward, that you need to put a price on those emissions so that the ship operators can actually have the proper energy efficiency. They can actually make those energy efficiency and environmental efficiency gains, which we don't have so far. And then maybe just the second point, and then we can move on to kind of let other people speak, is the issue about space as well, because I think the point about these big ships is because they're not fully laden, it means there are space on these ships. And there was a very good study done last year by the ICCT, which looks at the ships going from the United States to China, so one of the longest trade routes. And it kind of looked at this issue of fuels, because obviously right now we use fossil fuels, which are very, very impressive, and they have very, very good energy density. And the point about new clean fuels like hydrogen, ammonia, other things like this, is they will have less energy density. So one of the arguments we hear often is if we move to those clean fuels, there will be big issues because of space, not enough space on board. But what this ICCT study found is that on that trade route, one of the longest trade routes in the world, if you just take 5% of cargo space, then you would make room for hydrogen engines, having the more space for the fuel. And obviously hydrogen is not as energy efficient as other things like ammonia. So basically, I think this is one interesting thing just to take into account when we have the conversation. It is about this issue of space. So maybe I'll leave there, but yeah, happy to kind of talk more things later.
Yes, thank you very much, Jakob. And I think there will, of course, be questions, but I would like to give the floor first to Martin Dosman from the European Chamber of Ship Owner Association. I'm probably got it wrong again, although I have met you numerous times. I'm terrible with those acronyms. We have heard the rationale, the economic rationale behind the model of big ships. And I would like to know, is this really true for all ship owners? Are all ship owners happy with this concept of big ships? Because I know that the European ship owners are a very heterogeneous group, and we have a lot of SMEs which might not have the mega ships under their remit. And I would like to know, how do you view the current crisis? We have heard that many shipping lines have blamed poor stakeholders for congestion, but what Olaf has shown us is a bit contradictory to that. So I would like to know how you assess the current issue and also the development towards ever larger ships from the perspective of the European ship owners.
Yes, thank you, Jutta. Olaf raised a lot of topics, so I don't know how long I'm able to and allowed to speak. But let me start with some general remarks about the ship size. I think we have to realize that in all shipping segments, ship size is increasing, and that's a phenomenon that is part of the history of shipping. Ships become bigger. Not only container vessels, we see it on all segments. If we look at the ferries now sailing between Hook of Holland and the UK, they are not comparable to the ferries, let's say 30 years ago. And why is that? Because the cargo volume is simply there. There is a need for bigger vessels, and vice versa. The increase in the ship performance, and especially the containerization, made it possible to transport goods globally at lower cost all over the last decades. And we should also not forget that increased, of course, global wealth considerably. Hundreds of millions of people were able to raise from poverty to get a better standard of living, all due to shipping. So let me start with that. If I turn to environmental performance of shipping, we are on the pathway to become, let's say, climate neutral. We want to decarbonize. And yes, there should be a price on emitting CO2. We support it as industry. There should be a business case to switch to the alternative fuels, once they are there. They are not there at this moment. So, but we are supporting the carbon price idea. So, and we put proposals forward to the IMO. Returning to the question of larger vessels and let's say port performance. Ports, they accommodated the larger vessels over the last, let's say, centuries. Rotterdam, well, the most recent extension was Maasvlakte 2, but before that it was Maasvlakte 1. So increasing the port capacity to deal with the increased cargo volumes, that's nothing new. It's a practice. And the question, of course, that was also raised, who is financing that investment? Yes, sorry, there's some labor doing some work. Who's financing that? Public authorities, of course. But if it is public infrastructure, who is financing that? It should be part of the port fees. There should be clear rules for financing public infrastructure in ports so that ports can't compete with each other on that public expenditure. There should be clear rules for that, and that's an EU obligation. If now turning to COVID and the impact of COVID, yes, reliability is extremely low. All the major container liners recognize, and they do their utmost to improve it as quickly as possible. And they don't blame ports. It's a combination of factors that's extremely rare. Of course, first we saw the impact of COVID in China with factories closed in the first quarter of 2020. China recovered remarkably quickly. Nobody expected that. But at the same time, Europe closed down. So there was a remarkable disbalance between demand and supply of goods. Ports in the US, huge congestion, not because also port workers fell ill due to COVID. Shortage of container because demand picked up so quickly. The latest forecast of the World Bank published last year, they expect growth of the world economy this year by 5.6%. It's the strongest, and now I quote, it's the strongest upturn after a crisis in 80 years. We are living in very special times, not only COVID, but also the very strong economic recovery we now experience. And all the container vessels are sailing, except the one that has to go into a shipyard for maintenance or for the compulsory inspections, but all capacity is used. New build orders, if you look at the new build orders now placed at the yards for container vessels, it's huge. So the container liners see the demand, they expect it will continue, and they start ordering. So they do everything to increase the reliability, because they also recognize the service levels now, that's much too low. On some other topics that Olaf raised, on alliances, and let me start with that. Alliances, the container block exemption regulation. Alliances are possible under an EU regulation that was approved recently by DG Competition. We all know how tough Commissioner Vestager is on topics. We know the court cases she brought forward against the big multinationals. So if that commissioner is approving consortia block exemption regulation, there is no issue regarding competition. Can't be the case. Concentration, there is a nice index that displays the level of concentration, and if it's below a certain level, there might be issues for let's say, competition. The index is way above that minimum level, let me put it that way. So in addition to all the nice graphs that Olaf showed, we need figures, we need statistics. We don't need graphs suggesting a correlation, but we need to discuss evidence-based. We need to agree on a joint understanding of the factual situation, and then we are able to start discussing what is the situation, what can we do about it, is there a need for dialogue? Of course, dialogue is always needed. That's why I'm pleased that we now have this discussion. But if there's a dialogue, should it be at Brussels level or should it be at national or local level? And one final remark on the public investment in infrastructure. It's not only shipping. I worked for the Betuwe route, the rail connection between Rotterdam and the German border. The Betuwe route is financed by the government. The fixed investment costs are financed by the public, by the taxpayer. I also pay for the Betuwe route. The maintenance cost, that is charged to the user, so the rail operators. If the fixed investment cost would be charged to the rail operators, it simply won't work. It was way too expensive. But the bigger interest, of course, for the society as a whole, is that there is a model split for transporting containers from Rotterdam to Germany. So not only trucks, but inland waterways, and the same applies to inland waterways. Investment in bridges, in locks, it's public money, because there's a bigger societal interest. So that's a couple of remarks. I realize I can go on for hours, but the presentation by Olaf forced me to give a little bit longer answer. Thank you very much.
Yes, I won't let you to go on for hours. I was just about to say, and I find it very interesting because you more or less contradicted to Olaf and said, well, we need figures. I actually had the impression that the graphs are underlined by, are fed with figures, because else you can't draw a graph. But I would like to come back to some questions which were more or less raised in the chat. One was already asked a bit before, and it's turning rather to the environmental side. How could other environmental costs beside, of course, CO2 emissions be taken into account? What would be a possible model to price these? So maybe that would be something that Jakob could elaborate on. And I think it was very interesting to hear that the port fees should cover the dredging cost and that we need EU rules for that. I think Vera and I have to look into the treaty whether the EU would even be able to apply such a regulation, because usually member states are quite special when it comes to their own competences, and they're usually not so happy when the EU comes in and says, well, we want something being done differently. And one last remark on your comparison with the rail. Well, shipping does not pay taxes at all within the EU, at least as long as the ships are not flagged with an EU flag, which the majority is not. But first to Jakob, and then maybe we don't have a lot of time. We only have 2 minutes left. Maybe someone knows whether we can do something from the EU level to the port fees being attributed to the dredging cost.
Thanks, Jutta. So on the question of kind of how to price, or I think how to regulate would be a better kind of more broader way to go at the problem. Some of these environmental things, and the first thing that you just said is that first of all we need to get the shipping to pay for its environmental impact, because it is one of the only sectors in Europe, in the world, that doesn't pay for the external costs. I think the point about public money going into different things, be it port infrastructure, be it as well. One thing that I didn't mention at the beginning as well is in 10 years' time, one of the ways we're going to reduce emissions from shipping is port electrification. It's making ships at berth plug-in, so that they will, direct electricity, the most direct way to reduce emissions. But this implies a lot of investment as well from the port side. And the point is, like a lot of these questions, who is going to pay? At the moment, shipping is paying for nothing, whereas all of the other sectors are paying for their environmental costs. So this is one thing that is just basic. You need to have some mechanism, at least on Europe, to get shipping to pay, and that's just kind of basic. And then maybe just to touch on the other thing is how to price or how to deal with other things like the other environmental impacts. I think there's a whole range of things you can do, but it doesn't necessarily have to be paying. So things like noise at sea, part of this is to get ships to go slower, And this is something very easy that gets noise, that helps biodiversity, and also will reduce emissions. There's things like open loop scrubbers that you can ban, and that will improve water quality. It will have less invasive species, less biodiversity risks. And then there's things like dredging. First of all, you need, in terms of figures, absolutely, we need to do things like look at dredging, see its CO2 impacts, see its other kind of environmental impacts of that you need to look at as well. But so it's about, first of all, in terms of the wider climate impact, it's about pricing shipping and make sure shipping pays like every other sector. And then the second thing is there's a lot of individual issues which shipping needs to look at as well, for the local and kind of wider community good.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jakob. And there was a very interesting question in the chat asking for the views of each participant of the panel. Are ever bigger ships the only way forward? Because what we have heard a lot on the European level, but also on national level after the COVID crisis with the disruption of the supply chains, a lot of people said, well, shouldn't we reshore some of the production to Europe in order to make our economy more resilient towards disruptions, be it through COVID, be it through climate issues, be it through whatever thing we can maybe not even imagine today? And is there another way than ever bigger ships? And I mean, everyone here knows that a lot of things that are shipped across the ocean are just shipped across the ocean because shipping is so incredibly cheap. We all know this example from the pears of Chile, which are shipped to Thailand to be peeled and packed and then shipped to the US. And no one can tell me that this is environmentally viable or efficient. So we all know that there are a lot of things being shipped for many, many thousands of kilometers or miles, so to speak. And so I would like to hear from each panelist, are bigger ships the only way we can imagine a global economy? Or is it possible maybe to, within the Green Deal, within circular economy, within longer use of goods, to rethink also the way we transport things? And I will give each of you 1 minute, and then I will hand over to Vera for the second panel.
Can you start with?
Go ahead, Martin.
Yes, that was the danger. Thank you. Bigger ships. It's not up to the regulator to regulate the size of ships. It should be the market. The condition is, of course, that all external costs should be included in the price of transport. And if that's done, then it's the market that will decide how big the vessels will come. I already explained that we are supporting the proposal to include a carbon price for the price of shipping. Once we have alternative fuels, there's no discussion about it. On other emissions, for example, underwater noise, it can also be done by innovation. Propellers, hull size, etc. Slow steaming ships are already slow steaming. So it should be left to the market to decide on the ships of the size of ships. And I want to refer to one slide that Olaf showed us, and that's a very good slide. It showed the average size of a container vessel under 5,000 TEU, the average size, and the maximum size 25,000 TEU, meaning there are a lot of container vessels relatively small. So we should not focus only on the big ones. We should look at the sector. It's the market that decides on which routes we can use the bigger vessels, and perhaps they might become even bigger if there's a carbon price introduced. The EU ETS might lead to even bigger vessels. If that's the choice for the operator to deal with that, okay, that's the market. And the regulator introduces that carbon price. So we should have a very careful look at what we talk about. What are the statistics saying of? Is there a correlation, as sometimes suggested by Olaf, or is that just a suggestion? Is it working in practice in another way? And on some points, it is working in another way. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. Nicolette.
Thank you. I would like to answer your question. I think that all the smaller container vessels cascaded to niche markets. To be honest, and Martin knows this, I think on the large Europe-Asia trades, of course, where the majority of the shipping takes place, but also to maybe to the US. We only see the MECA container vessels, and they are here. Probably they're here to stay. I mean, shipping is a deregulated market, but my thinking then would be, if we look at the European road transport market, if we look at the rail transport market, they're all regulated because of the risk and they have to operate in economies. I would not be against some sort of a regulation there. And maybe at some point, even today, I can't say that shipping is cheap anymore. If the cost of a container is up to $20,000, you can't claim that is a cheap transport cost. I know that, and we actually within ClayCut we discussed it. There's of course a risk of nearshoring. People are looking at other areas for production. They're looking at Turkey, at Eastern Europe, to go nearer. We also have shippers that claimed recently in one of our events that they are looking to other modes to use rail freight from China, which maybe is more reliable. It seems to be much more reliable. Of course, with the volumes, the rail freight, the market cannot sort of operate and handle all those volumes. But I think that there may be knock-on effects also on the shipping market that would be really a pity for all those investments. And yeah, maybe to say something on the data that Martin is referring to, we would be really happy if you can share the data, because no doubt the shipping industry itself has the data. And to come forward to that, because yeah. But let's keep it to the question you raised. I think there's definitely it's going to be a trend, and actually a point I had not had a chance to make is that we do support an ETS system for shipping as ClayCut. We do support that sort of pricing for CO2, and that goes that indeed is much more ambitious than what we currently see at the IMO.
That's true in any case. Having listened to so many member states in the IMO making their contribution, I was like, okay, nothing will ever happen here, or at least not anytime soon. So Jakob, it's for you to sum up.
With the TNE.
So Jakob, it's for you to sum up, and just one very small remark on markets, Martin. There is no market without rules. Even black markets have rules. So it's our job to set the rules for the market to deliver not only the cost efficient, but the generation efficient way, because these are costs that are there. We are passing them on to the next generations. The German Umweltbundesamt has calculated that the cost of a ton of CO2 emitted today in 2100 is correlated to a damage of over 600 euro. And these are costs which we just shift into the future. And it's our job as politicians to bring those rules to the market in order to make those costs visible. But I'll pass on to Jakob.
A short remark on this, Jutta, because you referred to me. I fully agree. A strong market needs a strong government. Markets have to be regulated. Otherwise, the outcome would be, well, a Wild West economy. That's not acceptable. And I also fully agree that shipping should decarbonize as quickly as possible. And once again, we are supportive of having a carbon price for the fossil fuels. We have to make the switch to those zero carbon fuels as quickly as possible. So that's why we as a shipping industry at European and international level, we are so active to make that happen. And we also introduced a proposal to have an international R&D fund established, 5 billion euros, US dollars, total effect 10 billion US dollars, to make the switch, to do the research and development for these alternative fuels. I wish they were here already, then we could make the switch, then we could have the carbon price immediately at a global level. And but I fully share your goal. That's not the discussion here. Thank you.
So just the final word on me, I'll try to be very quick. I think just on the question you asked on things like reshoring and circular economy, these are very, very interesting kind of arguments, and maybe this, but obviously maybe not to kind of for me to conjecture on. But I do think that the issue about circular economy is definitely worth thinking about, because if we have a circular economy in the next 10, 20 years, what it means is less traffic. So if we have this trend towards much bigger ships, but also we can envisage in 20 years less traffic, then there is an issue here. And this does come into this kind of more this wider argument about the market and about what to do, because I think Jutta it's completely correct what you say, but all the time what Martin says is true, that we should leave things to the market as much as we can. But let's not forget climate change and all of these other local environmental issues are kind of gaping up failures of the market. And if we don't do something now, thinking about future generations, knowing what's going to happen in the future, then as you've said, we're just leaving it to future generations, which is not possible. So exactly, I mean, but the point is to focus on what we can do now, which is to be as ambitious as possible in Europe. And it's not going to be easy in terms of fuels. No one said it was going to be easy. If there was another fuel, obviously we'd go for it, which is why we need to be incredibly ambitious and strong in setting the legislative framework now, so that in 10 years' time, we have, we push the market towards the clean zero emissions vessels.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think we have taken up 10 minutes longer than we should have. It's my fault. I should have been the timekeeper here. So please forgive me, Vera, and I will pass on to you for the moderation of the second panel.
Thank you so much, Jutta. And yes, it's difficult as a politician to not give you opinion during the debate, I know, but we'll get this in time. We manage both. So now we have the second panel, and we have 4 speakers, and each speaker gets 5 minutes. And because it would be nice if we also come to a conclusion and also have questions after this panel. For the first panelist, the theme, if you don't know yet, is big ships seen from the shore side. So the other perspective from the shore side. And first of all, let me introduce to you Magda Kobzinska. I don't see you yet, but I guess I don't have all the people in front of me. Welcome, Magda. Nice to have you here. And she is director of the waterborne transport at DG Move of the EU Commission. So again, welcome, Magda. Nice to see you. And I'm really interested in the reaction from your perspective from the EU Commission on the situation as described.
Thank you very much, Vera. I hope I'm seen and I'm heard. If you just, okay, you know that you have.
Yes, great, thank you.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Fortunately, I was lucky to actually be able to join the previous panel earlier than expected. It's a day of shipping with the European Parliament. That's my second event in a row with MEPs talking about shipping, different aspects, but still. So I'm a bit puzzled because 3/4 of what I wanted to say has been covered by other speakers. So I'm gonna, that will make cutting down to 5 minutes even faster, but I'm really looking forward to questions, discussions, and also hearing those panelists who will come after me. I think, and I probably am repeating a bit what you already heard. I think the sort of the excuse for the event today is the case of Ever Given blocking Suez Canal, but I would just like to recall that it's the Suez Canal and it's the COVID situation that disrupted a smooth functioning of the maritime chain. I know that some of the speakers and probably also some of those who are watching that debate will not necessarily agree with the smooth functioning, but normally I always complain that shipping is not really a visible sector. And when I say shipping, I should be saying maritime transport, because I also include ports. This is the sector that normally works so well that nobody cares about it until either Ever Given happens or we start seeing the type of disruption that has been happening over the last 14, 16 months. I think Martin in his intervention explained a bit the flow of events, where blockages occurred first and then second, and Europe stopped, or China stopped, Europe stopped, US stopped, then China moved, and Europe started to move, so on and so forth. We should also not forget that another element that was extremely important during COVID was the huge impact that the situation had on people who are working in all sectors, on ships, but also on the shore side. I saw in the chat that somebody asked a question why we are not talking about workers. I think please don't, if the word doesn't come in the discussion, that doesn't mean that we were not concerned with people working in the maritime chain throughout COVID. But coming back to the main point, you know, the size of vessels, are they too big, are they too small? I think the problem that we are seeing with maritime transport is that it's a sector that has been extremely efficient in organizing itself. And efficiency very often means that you're functioning with minimum spare capacity. So the moment we've seen the COVID situation, whatever spare capacity there was anywhere, it's been used up. And then we saw that all of a sudden that capacity is missing, lacking, you know, no containers, no vessels, ports being troubled because of slowdowns on the seaside with less planned arrivals and departures, and so on and so forth. But I also believe that maritime transport has been the sector that has proven on so many occasions that it can rebound, and it will. And what we are seeing now is still unusual situation. And let's not forget, even if, you know, I assume all of us or most of us are vaccinated, ready to travel, ready to go back to our old way of functioning, but the world as such is not yet out of COVID. And when we are talking about a global sector like shipping, it is heavily impacted by situations also elsewhere in the world, and not just in the EU. So everything that we are observing about how the sector functions is unusual situation. And I'm saying that because on the one hand, crisis situations are good excuses to push for looking again into our policies, you know, legislative regulatory framework. But on the other hand, crisis situations are not necessarily ideal, no, let me put it differently. Crisis situations require careful analysis so that whatever decisions we take as the effect of those crisis situations does not actually put the entire sector and its functioning on its head, and it does not actually disrupt what has been working rather smoothly. I'm very well aware of the many questions that were put in Olaf Merck's presentation. We've talked with Nicolette and the stakeholders of her organization. Often I also believe that I do know what will come, at least partially, in the discussion that will follow. But just to say that on the Commission side, we are looking at the situation, but I really don't think that we should be jumping into a policy decision unraveling everything that has been functioning relatively well. Just to tell you also that, and that's going to be the last thing that I'm going to say, that we are also not looking on that on our own. We have also been in touch with competition authorities on the other side of the Atlantic, with the FMA on the US side. We'll be having we have regular meetings with other competition authorities globally. And that question of the assessment of the situation in the maritime sector has been on the agenda of our discussions. I'm not touching on the environmental dimension because I'm sure it will come later on, so I'm happy to come in the second part.
Thank you. Yes.
I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Magda. That's so nice. You are in time and address everything we would like you to address. So next is our speaker, and someone, as mentioned by Magda, we are speaking for an hour, but not addressing from a worker's perspective. But our next speaker is Livia Vera, and she's the General Secretary of the European Transport Workers Federation. So welcome, Livia. To you, the question, also 5 minutes. What are the consequences of mega ships for workers, such as dockers and seafarers, but also drivers in combined transport? What can you tell us about that perspective?
Thank you very much, Vera, and thank you also to Jutta, Paulus for having organized this together with FIBORT and ETF. I will go straight to the point, but first of all, allow me to express deep frustration. There are a lot of members of the ETF attending this meeting, and I feel that they're also equally frustrated because this is not a new situation. So it was said by several of the speakers that spoke before me. Suez Canal, COVID came as a bit of a cherry on the cake, exacerbating a bit a situation that was already present. There is a broad coalition of stakeholders, as we're seeing today. So unions, logistic operators, port operators, shippers, and you name it, that are not necessarily always working together closely. And they all happen to say the same thing regarding the maritime supply chain and in particular shipping. But what we find in front of us, it's ship owners who have very defensive attitudes. So they are not ready for a dialogue. We heard what the approach was. We have read it in the chat as well. They are not ready for dialogue. They are just defending their position, and that the status quo doesn't have to be put in question. But what is even more shocking is the position that Magda has just expressed. The shipping sector works so well that do not need any intervention. This is even more shocking because you may remember that now it's a bit the past, but you may remember that there were 2 port packages and 1 port regulation with a bit of fuss around it that were exactly made because there were so many critiques about how the port sector was working and wasn't efficient and so, while everything is perfect on the shipping side. I mean, this is, I find, a bit, as I said, a bit frustrating. So let's try to overcome this this dogmatic approach, and let's try to have a dialogue. And that's why we have organized this meeting today. Also, regarding what was said before, the Commission has taken a decision on the block exemption regulation. If the Commission has decided this, that's true. I mean, the Commission, for those of you who believe in God, the Commission is not acting on the basis of God power. The Commission is taking decisions that are very often biased and politically oriented. So let's also not take it as something we have to accept as it is. So what are the effects on labor of mega ships? What were the effects in particular during the COVID and Suez Canal? No need to mention are there effects at all of the mega ships and of the alliances and so on labor? Yes, there are. Certainly the life of seafarers has not improved at all. We've seen and we still see how many of them are blocked on board ships. What is the effect on the other workers? Well, if we look at the dockers, at the port workers in general, because ports are larger than just than docks, even though there are not studies, this has not been studied extensively, and probably the studies published by the ITF OECD are among the few studies that have mentioned this, and this also gives us ideas. Probably in the future we could have a 4th study, we could have a cooperation again with ITF OECD for exploring this. But if we look, when we talk to our members, many of them can intervene later, it's very clear that when the bargaining power of terminal is so low compared to shipping companies, this has a cascading effect on port workers. It's much more difficult for us to renew collective bargaining agreement. It's much more difficult for us to defend and improve a working condition for the workers we represent in the ports. It has, of course, an effect on labor patterns. You know that one of the enemies of the ship owners and of the European Commission for many years has been the labor, the port labor schemes, the so-called labor pools. These have been an obsession. And yet these pools are the only way ports can cope with this kind of situation that originate from mega ships, from the blockage in the Suez Canal. This was the only way through negotiation by using these labor schemes that allow flexibility. This was the only way how ports could cope with the peaks and lows that originated, that were exacerbated by the blockage in the Suez Canal. So this is also the contradiction. On the one side, ship owners have always been at the forefront of attacking these schemes. On the other side, they are those who are actually benefiting these schemes, because it's the only way that ports can reverse the negative effect of the development in shipping. That affects also on cruise onboard tax. This is a small sector, but it's a very crucial one. There are, of course, shipping alliances that have, again, a bigger bargaining power with companies. They establish global contracts. It's a race to the bottom. In some cases, there is also vertical integration of these companies. And again, we see a push for lower crewing requirements, very difficult to negotiate collective bargaining agreements, very difficult to renew collective bargaining agreements. And there is also a third sector in maritime that is affected by this, and this is the feeder sectors. Because this is, Olaf said it very well, this is a sector that is developing due to the development of mega ships, but at the same time, if we look at the working condition there, these are all non-EU workers in EU waters. They are imposed tasks such as slashing that they shouldn't be doing, and they are constantly under pressure. There are a lot of problems with fatigue, with health and safety, and again, this pressure is increasing through the use of mega ships. No need to mention the effects on the roads, truck drivers, with all the problems we have, queues, congestions, and so on. And also for port workers, maritime workers are normally citizens in port areas, and this has negative effect on also the environment, on the pollution on the environment they work on. So the maritime sector is broader than shipping, and we can discuss whether the maritime sector deserves subsidies, tax exemptions, and so. But we can also discuss if the rest of the maritime chain, if these subsidies should be redistributed more equally, so as to take into account also the benefit of workers, because we can invest in one or the other transport sector, but we also have to take into account that there is no point in investing public money if there is no return in employment. And the last thing is, I mean, ship owners will always do what they are allowed to do, as any other category. So let's put it clear. So the big discussion here is what regulators are up to in order to make things more sustainable, more just to everybody, more just to workers as well. Because if we allow this or that group of employers or companies to do things, of course, they will do this. So really, I think the discussion has to be taken at regulators level, and it has to be a maritime supply chain discussion, not just focus strictly on shipping. Thank you.
Thank you, Livia. But also for me, for one question, because it's clearly, as you state, a bit of frustrating that we talk so much and then only now from a worker's perspective. But for me to be sure about this, so from your point of perspective, from the ETF, you say we need legislation on that ships and vessels don't get bigger. Is that something you wish, or that's something, we need better regulations, but on bigger or smaller ships we don't have a point of view?
Yeah, I mean, trucks and planes and any other transport means is regulated, so we don't see why we shouldn't have a dialogue on how ships should be regulated, taking into account that this is creating more expenditure for the rest of the world. So, and especially with a lot of public money. So we can't enlarge the size of train all of a sudden, but why can we do it with ships?
Okay, thank you. We have 2 more speakers to go before we come to the end conclusions. And our next speaker is Lamia Kadouch Belkaid. She is Secretary General of the Federation of European Private Port Companies and Terminals, better known as FEPort. Welcome, Lamia. Really nice to see you. I already complimented you on the great background you have. So can you tell us what are the consequences of increasing ship sizes for ports and terminals?
Thank you, Vera, and thank you. First, I would like really warmly thank you together with Jutta for listening to us when we came to you to discuss this issue of port congestion, indeed together with ETF, because we were as Freeport and also ETF very shocked by what we heard and read in the press with respect to the causes of disruption of the maritime logistic chain, which were namely, I would say, the main reason was actually the lack of efficiency of ports. And this was for us really a shock, because indeed, we, as it was mentioned by several speakers, ports are doing a lot, and since many years adapting and trying to cope with all the changes, which are, by the way, not always market driven, because I heard earlier that Martin was saying that it's market driven, but who is the market? I think that the decision is of course the ship owner's decision, and of course we respect their decisions as companies and undertakings. But at the same time, we are also on the private side in ports, and we are also compelled to invest to also accommodate bigger ships and cope with the change. So I think that we need a bit to clarify, as Livia said, and we need probably to discuss a bit more the impact of decisions that are very often unilateral ones. We don't have really a discussion prior to the investment that is made on the seaside. And this is something we have been saying for a long time. So for us, probably COVID and the Suez are only catalysts for us to see what is going on for already many, many years. And I think that this is a good opportunity actually to focus on what is going on. I would like also to say a few things. Everybody was afraid from the consequences of Suez. But in fact, what happened is that the European ports have been coping with the situation. And this has been done in a very silent way. No advertisement, no papers, no, a lot of news. We have not seen that. But contrary to what we have seen in the previous months, where we were stigmatized as port stakeholders, and everybody was complaining about congestion. So I think that I agree with Magda, we should celebrate a bit more ports. And I fully agree with Livia. I think ports are also an important stakeholder, be it on the public or private side, doing a lot to make the supply chain function. And this was I think very useful, because once the cargo reaches ports, it needs to be unloaded and it needs to reach its final destination. And I would like to pay tribute to all the transport workers, not only, I would say, on the seaside, but also on the land side, and not only at the level of ports, but also downstream the port. And my colleague Teresa will say something about that a bit later. What I wanted to say, because I think a lot has been already said, what we miss, if we start to talk about resilience, for me, resilience it means maturity, but it also means cooperation. And I think that this is not what has happened in these last years. I am very sorry, but when I hear that the BER was actually, the consortia BER was renewed because we had actually, there were good arguments and there was no economic, I would say, study that actually was justifying the renewal of the consortia BER. This was done on a pure legal, I would say, on the 4 criteria that were used by DG Competition to assess the importance of this regulation. So I think we agree data is needed. From my point of view, the data that has been shown today, even if I do not, I'm not an economist and able to assess all, I would say, the data that has been provided, I think this was indeed an important data showing, at least for the port sector, the impact of big ships. When you have a big one, I think that you don't need to do a lot of very long studies to understand from the port perspective. If you have one big ship coming every 3 days, this means like a technical unemployment for 4 other days for workers. It means fixed costs for the companies which are in ports, like my members, for instance. So for us, obviously, we would prefer to have more frequent calls, more ships coming into ports, probably presenting less problems in terms of, you know, maintenance, dredging, etc. Of course, but we can still do with big ones. But then in terms of economic model, and this is what the discussion today is about, is are we going to put our eggs in one single basket? Shouldn't we try also to build medium-sized ships? Because I think that this is also what the market probably needs. I'm not sure that the market needs only a massification of the flows. And we saw it with COVID. COVID, probably there will be some relocation, reshoring, and maybe this is what we need to prepare when we talk about resilience and recovery. And this is where we need the regulator, and especially from the Parliament side, this is where we need your support in trying to understand what is going to happen in order not to be compelled to actually accept any kind of model, which is, by the way, not always, I would say, only about European strategies, because I'm very happy to have a very strong European fleet and I would say very healthy ship owners. But the ships most of the ships are built in China. And again, this is a model that is run also and benefit to another economy. So for us, I would be very glad if tomorrow we have more ships built in Europe, for instance, and my colleague from Sea Europe is probably happy to hear that. But this is what I think what we need to start as a discussion, is this model actually bringing added value for all parties collectively. And
thank you, Lamia.
So this
thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you made really clear what your point of view is, your perspective. So thank you for that. And then that brings us to the last speaker of this panel, and that's Theresia Hacksteiner. She is the Secretary General of the European Barge Union, the EBU. Hi, Regi, nice to see you again. So other modes of transport, such as inland navigation, have been adapting to the increasing size of maritime ships and also to port congestion. What are the experiences of the inland waterways section? Can you tell us more about that? You are muted, Theresia. We cannot hear you.
Yes, thank you. The classical fault. Hi, Vera, and many thanks to you and also to Jutta for organizing this event and raising this very important topic. And well, many things have already been discussed before, but the contribution from my side is from a different angle, being from the land side and more in particular from the waterway land side. And there, container congestion in the seaports is a huge problem for inland waterway carriers since many years. The reason for that in particular lies in the fact that barge owners and operators are no part of the contractual relationship between the deep sea terminals and the carriers, and nor between the shippers and forwarders, and they are thus dependent on other parties such as the deep sea carriers and terminals. We have also to stress, and I therefore disagree in particular also with Magda, that the COVID influence even, of course, worsened the situation, but it's not the origin for the problem, nor is, for instance, indeed the ever-given accident. In what we have experienced already in the last decade is that indeed the landscape of the liner shipping has drastically changed, and thus caused to our experience the current situation of container and port congestion with a detrimental effect on our sector. And what we also have discovered that to serve this changed landscape the best, some port authorities developed a policy mainly focusing on volumes and traffic as opposed to quality. And indirectly, this strategy facilitates the current way of acting of liners. The increasing number of the megaships which call at their premises are a guarantee for an increase in volume and business for these ports. But on the other hand, they have a disrupting effect on the overall quality of the local port operations. In case of any disturbance in the schedule, all other operations are adapted or delayed, resulting in issues for other parties in the supply chain. And for the inland navigation, our members, the most visible result is the structural congestion at the case in several European seaports, affecting in particular their reliability, as well as the modal shift ambition in a serious way, and also imposing high additional costs on the sector. Our members, together with our association and also the inland terminal operators, have undertaken several measures in the past to cope with the problem. They have, for instance, bundled container volumes and set up so-called fixed windows or corridors in order to cope with the operational challenges in the seaports. This has led to operational improvements indeed, but also the substantial costs in the hinterland, and to be paid by the shipper, forwarder, or the barge operator himself, and also to less flexibility for the shipper, forwarder, barge operator. So in other words, what we experience, there's operational efficiency in the seaports at high cost in the hinterland. And by deep sea terminals on their part also take measures to cope with the unreliability of the deep sea carriers, for instance, with the so-called cargo opening and cargo closing. This also led to operational issues for our members. In concrete terms, this led to a serious imbalance and an essential link in the international container trade. It also should be about the guaranteeing a certain level of services and overall reliability towards all users in the port, resulting in a more smooth and future-proof connection between liner shipping and the entire hinterland operational system and supply chain. Therefore, we are a bit puzzled that the European Commission, on one hand, has recently released its new policy framework, which was already expected since a couple of years, the European Green Deal, and also further elaborated in its sustainable and smart mobility strategy, in which it, for instance, announces a substantial increase of modal share towards inland waterway transport. But on the other hand, it has also continued to grant specific positions to certain parties in the chain, for instance, with the consortia block exemption regulation. So therefore, we are indeed also calling upon the Commission to take appropriate actions to create a kind of level playing field in order to cope with this problem, which is indeed not a problem of today or yesterday, but already known since many years to the parties involved and also the European Commission. And in our belief, also the Commission has a role to play, as it has, as the ports have their role to play, and the carriers have their role to play. But in particular, we call upon, it has been mentioned already by a couple of previous speakers, a monitoring system to monitor the situation, to collect indeed all the necessary information in order to gain a balance between all parties involved, and and also allowing a proper functioning of the entire supply chain. And I think I don't need to repeat all the arguments that have been brought up by the previous speakers. So we would like to strongly also support, and to me, the presentation by Olaf at the very beginning was a very clear one. And I think he highlighted a couple of measures that could be very helpful to overcome the situation. And in concrete terms, it needs a kind of open and close cooperation between all the parties involved, creating a level playing field and to well, to cope with the situation from a transparent perspective. Well,
thank you, Teresa. Thank you for your valuable point of view. And you were the last speaker of the second panel. And again, I think the combination of first the introduction of Olaf and Vera from panel 1 and panel 2, we see how, as I already told you at the beginning, a really, really interesting lineup we have. So we see a really different perspective sometimes on the same solutions. We are on the same problem, and what are the solutions? So for me, trying to conclude a little bit from my perspective, this was really helpful doing my job and thinking about what are the issues of the future and what should we do from a European Union perspective. And that could even, as you already know, also be not the same as Jutta, but thank you all the speakers and also the respectful way that you were trying to have this conversation. I thank you for that. It was really helpful. And first of all, for me, the presentation of Olaf and all the policy advices, I take them by heart, because for me, this was really, those were remarks I would like to think about. And I have to think about this event to make sure that every perspective is weighed in the possible way. But yes, it was really helpful for me. And to be more specific, as a social democrat, I'm a strong supporter of the best possible working conditions for transport workers, seafarers, dock workers, and already for truck drivers. So the problem of port congestion and peaks, I think it really contributes in a negative way. And also, as a policymaker, I think whenever society changes, we have to make new and better rules. Not to make more rules, but if we see that there is a problem, we have to act. And I heard also some of you, like Magda said, well, if there is a crisis, don't change policy right away, because it's a crisis. It's something that not happened every time. But then I'm more of the people who think that, no, this is, I guess somebody of you already mentioned it, this is not just a crisis, it's a catalysator. It's making more obvious where the problems are, who are already there, who already exist. I'm not a person who wants to make more rules, but in this case, I really think that we should really think about also the advices we got from Olaf. I will really think about it, and especially if we see that on trucks and buses, we have regulation in the EU by the so-called weight and dimensions directive. Yes, I really think that we must comply with these rules, and also now search for a way to also get shipping into these weights and dimensions directive, because I really listen carefully, and this is my point of view for now. So to give also Jutta, Paulus the floor and come to her conclusions and let her say thank you. Last remark, special thanks to Freeport and ETF, because they were really inspiring me to come together like this. So thank you for that. And now I'll give the floor to Jutta, Paulus for the last remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Vera. And from my side also, thank you to all our distinguished speakers, and also to the organizers, the technical staff in the background that made this event possible. For me personally, it has yet been another glimpse into the heterogeneous world of shipping, I might say so, and also to, well, maybe rethink the concept of looking only at the efficiency of the fuel consumption, but also take into account other environmental and societal issues when we are looking at the developments in the shipping sector. I've been trying to follow the chat in parallel. I've seldomly experienced such an active chat during an event, and I might come back to one of you or the other. And please do not hesitate to contact me if there are any special needs or wishes or anything that might be related also to the EU maritime file, which will be coming up. And I think we all, as European policymakers, should try to reflect all sides for also the maritime sector. As Green, I'm of course focusing on the environmental issues, but it was very valuable for me to hear the societal issues of the workers that are employed in the ports and on the ships. Of course, there have been quite some coverages in the media, but mainly focusing the working conditions on cruise ship vessels, because these are much more in the focus of the public, but not so much on the container vessels. This only started with the current crisis, where a lot of seafarers were deprived of leaving the ship and going home. So from my side, again, thank you very much for this important event and for your contribution. And I believe that we will meet again at the one or the other occasion. And I would like to give the very final word to Freeport. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jutta, and thank you, Vera, again. And I think that I will share my time, my few minutes also with Livia on behalf of ETF. As I said, it all started with a very important discussion with you, both of you, Jutta and with Vera, about the fact that we found it really, I would say, appalling that we were at some point bashed as port stakeholders on the port congestion, which was not the real reason for this disruption. And I think it is very important for the EU to value all the different segments of the maritime logistic chain and all the workers along the chain, because this is the wealth also of the European Union, to rely on those workers. I think that indeed we need to carry on the discussion, and we are happy as Freeport to continue this with you. I leave it to Livia if you want to say a few words. Thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Lamia. And yeah, just very shortly, not to keep anybody online. I think it was a very lively, very heartfelt discussion. There is a lot of passion around these discussions, and I think it's not the first appeal and it's not the first occasion for a dialogue that we launch as ETF and Freeport together. By the way, ETF and Freeport are not do not agree on everything. So when we agree on something, it means that is something very important. But joking apart, I think it's not the first appeal that we send for a dialogue. And I think in the future we should launch really concrete initiative for a dialogue around shipping with the stakeholders, but also with the institution. So I'm sure what I heard from Jutta and Vera is very promising. I feel very strong interest around this, and I hope that the European Parliament will take the lead and will also slowly push the Commission to move into more constructive dialogue around the maritime supply chain. And thanks again to all those who are involved in the preparation and in the making of this seminar today.
So thank you all and goodbye.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Bye-bye, bye.
Goodbye, thank you.
Goodbye, thank you. Thanks you so
Bye-bye.
much. Ciao, Nicolette. Ciao, bye.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye, thank you.